the sake of full disclosure, sometimes I do turn them public, but only when there's not student faces on them because I want to respect your privacy. Okay, so let's do our check-ins, and I will start a. Go ahead and just check in.
Sake of full disclosure, sometimes I do turn them public, but only when there's not student faces on.
Oop, have to mute that. Okay, so we're recording. We're live. You guys can hear me. I see Aika. Hi, Aika. I see Allison and Crystal. I have a poll for you today. So I'm going to launch the poll. So you guys can check in. You can do that poll. We'll talk about your answers. And while you're doing that, I am going to put some fun visuals on. Do, 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 do. Where is it? It's one of these. There we go. Okay. I wanted to go to here. All right. I'm going to turn this way down low, but make it big. So this is a Cirque du Soleil show called KURIOS. And I thought it would be a fun place for us to start because we're covering basically two things today. We're in category B, which is the category is exoticism. And as far as what dances we're covering, we didn't get to meet last week, so we're doing way too much. We're not going to get to everything, I'm sure. But what I wanted to really talk about this week is circuses. This is obviously a very modern circus, but circuses and how they relate to colonialism and appropriation, and how we get this American idea of exoticism, which is to say othering of one group. So one of the things that's pretty obvious in a circus, especially in a circus like this, which is, this one is a steampunk fantasy, right? So I chose it partially because we're going to talk about the original World's Fair, which is set in the late 1800s. And so the costumes in this they're imaginary and they're sort of a little bit blended. Like that guy in the orange shirt looks almost a little 1950s-y. That guy is, the aeronaut looks 1940s-y. But then there's also a lot of Victorian-esque outfits. So like the stripes, that lady who just popped out would be Edwardian Victorian. And so it's a fantasy about essentially the Second Industrial Revolution, which is to say the steampunk fantasy era, right? So you have steam trains, steam engines, and these things, of course, really affected the way that farming was done, which is, of course, relative to all of the ex-slaves who were still being oppressed in the South through Jim Crow laws. So this fantasy is, I thought, really kind of like a nice counterpoint to all of the African-American dance we're going to talk about this week, because Cirque du Soleil is a Canadian multinational company, and they hire performers who are from all over the world. And they're usually doing blind casting, which is to say that they will hire the person who is the best at the technique that they want to use, and not necessarily hiring for a character's look or an actor's look, which is really great. And yet it's pretty white, right? Like most of these actors are, if not like UK white, they're European of some sort. And what I thought was really interesting about this piece in contrast is because we're going to talk about like, how did white audiences sort of mentally get in the habit of separating themselves, especially in America, also in Europe, but especially in America, from dance techniques and crazy new things that they were seeing. Like, why is it that that wasn't something that became integrated? And so this piece is actually pretty diverse if you were to take all of the clown makeup off everybody. Not within reason, but it really stands in contrast when you look at the World's Fair that we're going to talk about and where those particular dances came from originally. And when we talk about some of the other influences for this. So we have juggling, we have drumming, we have body percussion, we have acrobatics all going on here. And I wanted to, I'm going to skip forward a little hot second because we are short on time. Just get to this nice little dance scene. And I don't know if you guys can see it here, but they're doing, I would call this jazz dance, but look at those kicks, and that forward and back step that they're doing is a Charleston step. So most of the choreography in that little section was based on the Charleston. And then I'm gonna pause and switch to the next one, which I hope is still up. Boop. Yes. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
No wonder my computer's chugging. It's running multiple things at once. Is it here? No. Okay. Well, for the sake of time.
They did audition in my country, and we were like required to go there. And one of my friends got into it, and it was like they came to my country, and it was Olympics or something, and they did a show.
Did you get to see it?
Yeah, I saw it once.
Do you remember
which? I don't remember what show because I was only in 8th grade.
Oh. Do you want to share which country you come from?
I am from Kazakhstan. It's Middle Asia between China and Russia.
Nice. Did you feel like you went to the audition? You said, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you feel like there was much diversity in the company members that you saw there? Like, where were those people from? Could you tell? Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted, Aika. I don't know. It's like, where?
So at that time, I didn't really speak in English, but I remember, but like now I can read that a lot of them were like white people. Yeah.
Yeah. So this, when was KURIOS? It's their 35th production. I don't know when that means it was. It's interesting because the last couple of productions that I don't know if you guys know this, but Cirque du Soleil, being a Canadian company, they have shows which live forever in Vegas, but they also have shows which they tour internationally. And San Francisco is one of their experiment cities. So whenever they create a new, look at that Charleston step straight up. Whenever they create a new piece, they bring it to San Francisco first to try it out on the audiences to test out what works, what travels well, and what audiences think, which is pretty awesome because we usually get a new Cirque du Soleil show every few years. And they've definitely been trying to expand, right? They're French Canadian, and you can see a lot of elements here of Frenchness. Do you guys see any Frenchiness that you want to call out? Costume or movement?
I think the like white black thing is.
Yes.
Yeah, it reminds me like something. Like,
yeah, it's like a stereotypical French outfit, right? The white and black striped shirt with normally with a beret instead of a little red cap.
Yeah, and
and then you can see they're doing acrobatics, right? It's called hand balancing for obvious reasons, what they're doing right now. But you can see that the two ladies who are flying right now absolutely have ballet training. Like nobody's feet and legs look like that when they're born at all. But there's so much gymnastic flexibility here, and the rolling on the floor, the transferring of weight, sharing weight, all of that are elements that we see also in breakdancing and elements that we saw, for example, in the Nicholas Brothers and in swing dance moves, right? And I have the music muted here so we can talk, but you can hear how this is. It's definitely like Cirque du Soleil-ified music with the sort of mysteriously mumbled lyrics in a bunch of different languages, and like the production value. It definitely sounds like Cirque du Soleil music, but it's also definitely swing music they're using, which they don't always use. So there's lots of elements of jazz in this for sure. Look, they're doing a jazz square. Hooray! Nice timing. Thanks, video. So I just wanted to show that as like our starting contrast point. And I think it's also really interesting to just point out that like we are talking about a circus. They're wearing clown face makeup. And we're going to roll it back now to talk. I don't have videos for everything because I wasn't sure what I should skip and what I should not skip. But like the clown face makeup, which is generally pale face, it's outlined in black, the eyes and mouth are outlined, was partially a form of just really terrible theater makeup. So one of the like stage of dance that we're talking about a lot this past 2 weeks is okay, I gotta stop. I'm so distracted by that, you guys. I'm like, ooh, look at the pretty jumpings. So we are gonna focus this week on pre-vaudeville dancing. So that would be the dances that started, it's like if you think about amateur dance now. So we had talked in our first couple of weeks a lot about community dances. So dances where people were just meeting in the town square and the people themselves were dancing either as a celebration of their life and culture or as a celebration or act of spirituality. So then the next stage towards getting it more, I don't really want to use this word because it sounds judgmental and that's not what I mean, but more professionalized, more polished, so to speak, right, is when we have this pre-vaudeville era, which was circuses, sideshows, and performing acts, which would travel around the country. And this actually really relates to the economics part that we're going to get to in the future. So initially, let's say you had a family that was like really good at singing and dancing, and they did a little show, and they decided to take it on the road as a way of making money. So they would start traveling with a caravan, and there would be certain stops that you know would be good to stop at because maybe a town is really open to going to see performers, or the town is big enough to have enough people that there's enough interest and there's enough money for people to buy tickets, right? So those towns across the country become what's known as a circuit. And there were multiple circuits, circuit, related words, right? Multiple circuits in America, and those circuits themselves eventually became controlled by corporations, and they became stratified by race. So you definitely ended up with white circuits where the white minstrelsy was going on, and also black circuits where African-American or African not American dancers were performing for black audiences. And the Southern circuit that developed all the way through until Broadway time was called the Chitlin Circuit. And there was, we'll get back to those things in a couple of weeks. I just want to kind of like drop that bomb there. There's circuits. So one of the ways that circuits and circuses work is by bringing something to a small town. And remember, there's no TV, there's no radio yet. So really people had seen nothing except for what came from their very own hometown. And so when you are trying to entice people to come and buy tickets, you're going to make yourself seem as strange and exotic as possible. And this becomes a catch-22. So you want to come to town and show your talents and be celebrated by strangers, but also it's easier to sell yourself if you seem more remote and more, it's almost like, it's about capitalizing on the way that you feel. Like, I loved that some of you got a lot of the points that I saw in the reflections on how you felt with the Try It Out dance last week were people commenting on that either the dances were easier or harder than they expected, whether they reminded them of things they had done or not, and which moves were sort of surprisingly easier versus surprisingly harder. So I saw a couple of people hinting at that they were surprised that the hip hop, the simple hip hop moves video that you guys tried out last week were the easiest steps, but the breakdancing looked easy but felt hard, and that the West African dance moves were much more physically challenging than they expected. And sort of that break in a regular person's consciousness between what something feels like that you haven't done before and what it, like how difficult it is an element that performers often use to entice you to think something is even cooler. And that relates to the idea of exoticism. So I'm looking at my notes here to make sure that we're transferring. Okay, so let's talk about the World's Fair. So in Chicago, we had America's World's Fair, and you guys read a little bit about this. I think it was in last week's reading. Yeah. So the purpose of a World's Fair is to have all of the nations of the world bring their technology and share it to promote business, but also culture, dances, architecture, as well as what we think of technology now, which would be like science and industrialization. And it began, I believe, in England. No, was Paris was the first one? I have to look that up. Paris is the one that we usually all think of because most of the time these events had a structure that was built brand new to show off a new kind of architecture. And then it would stay up for most of a year while millions of people would pass through to see all of the exhibitions from the different countries. And we think of Paris all the time because that is how the Eiffel Tower was built, as an example of the new technology of steel and skyscraper construction. So in America, we had the World's Fair in Chicago. That was the biggest and most famous one. And what we built, and I think pieces of it are still there, but most of it is gone. What we built there was called the White City. And it was white. And it's interesting if you look at old maps, because basically they constructed this big white building for all of the industrialized, AKA Eurocentric at that time, nations to show off their stuff. And then anybody who wasn't white was like outside of the white city in an additional strip of land where they showed all of the culture and architecture of the colonies that these countries owned. And so even just that was already segregated because we were in America, right? So, you know, America at that time was putting all the white people in the big white building and all the not white people in the open air area because we were racist. let's not shuffle around, I guess. But what was interesting about that is that on the positive side, we did have a big mixed improvement in Americans' ideas and appreciation for other cultures. And we, just to be clear, America absolutely had colonies. So we just call them territories, but like still got them. And one of the things that was interesting at this time is that although from our perspective now, it might seem strange that people from those colonies might want to come and, you know, show their lifestyles outside of the big white building, that's actually a perspective that comes from having the privilege of having been in the building. And so I'm going to get back to that when I talk about the Native American dancers in England. But what I want you to know from that time, and I believe you saw, let me go to my desktop. I'm just going to kind of scroll through the class page so that you can go back to things on your own. Is this the page? Yeah, so this is talking a little bit about the World's Fair, introducing this article. And so at the time, the people who were putting on the fairs considered that they were doing an act of anthropology. The people who came from other countries were sometimes accurately from those countries and sometimes not accurate actually from those countries, because sometimes people would just say that's, you know, it's close enough because terrible racism, right? But what we did get was ideas about what other people's homes and cultures looked like that in America we had never, ever, 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 ever seen before. And these people would often demonstrate how they ate together, how they worshiped together, and how they danced together. And so from this World's Fair scenario, we got a lot of dance trends in the same way that we got dance trends from the community dances that were happening in America, such as the dancers that were happening in Congo Square and also Native American dances. And while we did not have very many Black people at the World's Fair because the racial tensions were so high that like there were actually big battles about even hiring African Americans to work there, we did have Native Americans, you know, who were on their native land that we had stolen, demonstrating their native dances in these World's Fairs. And that there's a really great article that I didn't put in this class because you guys have so much reading already that I always regret when we get to this point. So, I can't skip easily forward from this spot. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is why would these people come and dance in those World's Fairs and then on stage? And why do we think of it as exotic? And what is loaded into that? So my question for this week for you to ponder as you're doing this reading is really, if we have these dances where people are reclaiming their bodies through dance, reclaiming their cultural identity, what does it mean to show that dance to people who are not in your community? And in the case of the World's Fair, some of those colonies, they like started out not being as bad as they turned out later on. So if you were in an extremely poor country, say you'd had a famine, and an industrialized nation comes in and says, oh, look at this great technology. You know, we can plow your fields. It'll be fine. You'll just, you know, kind of sign on this dotted line here. It'll be fine. No worries about it. Right. We know how that didn't go well in the long run. But if you're in your first 20, 30 years of a relationship with a bigger country, it might not seem like the worst option. It might seem like the best option that you have for your people at that time. And some of those colonized cultures were still sort of in the honeymoon stage when they came to America. And the idea would be that they had an opportunity here to represent themselves as a culture that was worthy of respect from the industrialized nations. And this was also true of countries that were violently overtaken, because a lot of the time in the colonies that were violently overtaken, there might not have been like one nation in that spot. It might have been 3 or 4 smaller nations of the native people. And then when the white folks came in and took over, they drew these new lines and put these 4 tribes together that had never gotten along. And then after a while of being oppressed, those 4 tribes figure out like, we better get together and form a new nation to stand up to the oppressive culture. And oftentimes the way that 4 tribes that maybe don't even speak the same language come together is through dance, right? They start to use their bodies to dance together. We're going to talk about lots of examples of that, and we have before. And so when you add the layer of the World's Fair, sometimes newly re-independent colonies that had really disparate people in them would actually be actively forming a new national identity by figuring out like, okay, this is now that we have these lines that we didn't make up, what do we, these 4 people, have in common? And let's present that as our national identity and let's show it off at a World's Fair. So that was definitely happening as well. And then the interesting part about that, of course, is that, and this goes on today. This is sort of what I want to bring it to in current times, is that you have the constant question of selling out and of otherness when you bring a community dance to the stage. So if you're bringing your dance to the stage and you're showing off this really, something you're really self-identified with, something that could be spiritual, something that is powerful to you, and then you're showing it to an audience, and an audience is impressed, they want it, they want to see it, but also they're kind of making a little bit of distance. And that could be for a couple of reasons. For one, it could be that they're just making distance because it seems like that's really hard. Like, I don't know about you, but breakdancing is really hard. And so that in and of itself, that admiration makes a little space between the audience and the dancer. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes it's not good. And when it comes to Black dance in America, that distancing also is very much a part of our racial ideas about whiteness and control and Blackness and power. And that's where this crazy aesthetic of cool article comes in. So let's just pause here for a second and take a breath. Because that was a lot. Do you guys have questions about any of the things that we sort of covered just now? The idea in particular of exoticizing an other and how it's a double-edged sword. I just want to hear, like, does that make no sense to you or some sense to you? There's really no wrong answers here. Just like, can you tell me if how you understand that maybe is a better question.
So just to kind of cap things off with just the world, if there's one key takeaway from, because like I think when reading it was kind of dense. One key takeaway I took from it was basically like presented as this like presenting of these different cultures with like colonialist bias. Like is that kind of like the key one key takeaway you can gather from that? Because like it was really, I think like there's like some parts of the article where like it went into detail on how like a lot of these like colonialist countries, like I think America, Britain, and France, would insert their own like perspective or bias in presenting it too. Would that be like one of the key takeaways from reading that article? Because it was really dense and like that was just one key yeah. That's
exactly it. And just understanding how when we look back at it now, it looks like it's hard not to look at those visiting cultures and just wonder why they would put themselves in that position. Because from our perspective now, we just see all of the inherent racism and bias and like just manipulation that's going on because of the power of the empires or the colonizers onto those dances. And that can be even in the actual choreography, right? So we talked about a little bit about ring shouts, which I don't know that we showed the image of, but like a ring shout. Did you guys watch the Gullah Geechee ring shout video last week? I didn't see it yet, so I just wasn't sure. Maybe it's coming up. But like it's in a round, right? So you're performing the Gullah Geechee ring shout is a ceremonial dance that you do with call and response, and you move in a circle, and that circle represents the cosmology from African traditions of like life and death. And there's an image that I forgot to pull up in advance of this, but I will, where you're doing this dance in a circle to represent the passing from life to death. And for example, in a powwow, in a Native American powwow, the people are all around the dancer or performer, and the community members are dancing in the center of the audience. So in a white World's Fair or stage show, you have a proscenium stage, which is up above your audience and surrounded in a little box so that you like frame the story, and the performer performs out and draws the audience's attention from the front and center. And that already is going to change all of your dance moves, right? If you're performing out to the sides all the time, you're going to be turning and turning and turning and turning like you do in a breakdance cipher, which absolutely relates back to that ring shout pattern. But when you put it on a proscenium arch stage, you can't be like doing all of your performances back here, because this is just not as interesting to watch, right? You don't want to see the back of my head all the time. So that changes your dance moves to be facing front all the time. And that's just part one of the ways in which performing for a white audience changed these Native dances. So to kind of, does anybody else have any great questions like that? That was exactly the sort of thoughts I wanted to hear. Okay, feel free to interrupt me. For reals, I mean it. So to kind of cap that off, I wanted to share the story from this other article that I didn't share yet, which is the Native American dancers who performed in the World's Fair and also in these giant performances in Madison Garden. I think I talked a little bit about how they had been, some of their dances were changed by Belsartanism last week or last lecture, but they went on tour and performed for the Queen of England. And the Queen of England sounds fancy, but at that time it was even fancier. She was literally the most powerful woman in the whole world. She had colonies over like, I don't know, a third of the planet. She was the top of the top. Nobody had that much power at that time. And at the end of the performances by the Native American dancers, she spoke with them directly, like just one-on-one, and she said, you know, you are such an amazing performer and you have so much talent and beauty that you bring. Like, why are you doing this little, you know, showing up and dancing for the white people? You could be doing so much more. And his answer is, I need to find the actual quote for you because it deserves more reverence than I'm giving it. I apologize. But his response was, I don't know what you're talking about. I am being my authentic self. And aren't you honored that I stopped by to dance? And so it was such a beautiful moment because it really showed how even the Queen's impression that his performing for her was an act of servitude, that impression was absolutely a perspective of privilege in which she was putting herself above him. And he oh so gracefully told it to her face, oh no, you're here at my pleasure, which is so awesome. It's just like this moment in dance that I absolutely love. So I will dig that up and add it in for you guys. I apologize for not having it here. Okay, so let's look at our fun. How are we doing on time? 109. Okay, let's look at our fun poll for a little bit. Let's have a little shake it out and discussion. And then we will talk about the aesthetic of cool because that's going to lean us into next week, where we talk about the Africanist presence. And then we're going to talk about social dances and the swing era next week coming up. So that'll be really fun. So I mentioned Charleston today that we saw elements of in that circus act and the Nicholas brothers. So we're going to watch all those videos coming up next week. It's super fun. We're going to get to jazz, like not air quotes jazz, the jazz era. Okay, so end this poll. All right, I asked, have you been to a circus before? And we have 40% said yes. Does a fair count, says one person, and then another 40% that said nope. So I love that the idea of a fair is really interesting, because I think nowadays we have a fair, like our county fairs have rides that would still be the same, and we have animal shows that would still be the same. You might have like animal racing, pig racing, rodeos would be animal acts. Those are definitely consistent with pre-vaudeville traveling circus shows where you have trained animals. And then also sideshows and freaks. And we will get back to sideshows and freaks more, especially when we start talking about sexuality. But the idea of Americans at that time, since you probably lived either in an itsy bitsy little farm community, or maybe you lived in the big city, but most people still lived in farm communities. There was nothing besides like your family and your neighbor's family and your neighbor's neighbor's family. So it was excruciatingly fascinating to Americans before the 1900s to see different people, different ways of living, and different bodies. And that is also part of the idea that they were selling as a circus or a traveling act of exoticism. Have you seen live breakdancing? Oh, here, I can share these results with you so you can see them. Yay. One person said on stage, and 3 said in the community, which is awesome. And 1 person said no. So I just like to throw that one out there to kind of see how familiar we are. And then I am excited about, we're going to get back to the freak show and freak questions in the future. But what I wanted mostly to get to is the word cool. And it said, nobody says no. 40% said only for temperature, and 60% said all the time, which is exciting to me because last time I did that quiz, it was almost everybody said yes, they use the word cool to mean that something is awesome or interesting. And now it's starting to shift, which is why I wanted to ask that question. So first of all, did you guys get a chance to scan the aesthetic of cool article? So I know where to start talking about it. There's no wrong answers here, no shame. It's not about shame, guys.
I like glanced through it, and I think a lot of it went over like my, like it was really dense. I think I did really appreciate like the sort of like summary beforehand, because it kind of gave me like a rough idea. But I just want to clarify with that. So like the main idea is that there's like a difference between like white European definition of cool and like African American definition of cool. Is that kind of like the key takeaway from the article?
And what I want is for you to understand what that difference is and why. So let me pull that page for screen sharing, because I think it's nice to see where you can go back to something I'm talking about. And heads up, understanding the aesthetic of cool article is definitely part of your midterm and final exam. So the idea here, because we're going to get into using the idea of cool when we look at actual movement next week. So this aesthetic of cool, meaning, do we all know what aesthetic means? There we go. Concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty. Thanks, Siri. So when we think about the word cool, not having to do with aesthetics, there's first of all temperature, right? Hot, cold, cool. And when we think about the way that the word cool is used in Black culture, And this article, by the way, is from the 1970s. So that's another reason why I wanted to be like, does anybody even say cool anymore? Because it's not going to be a word that we use forever. But when we say cool in terms of jazz and in terms of Black movement, I want to make sure that we relate that idea back all the way to Africa. And so when we think of the idea of cool in terms of African aesthetics, what we're talking about is to have a mask or a facial expression of serenity that is worn not only in times of stress, but also in times of pleasure. So in contrast to that, think of the term keeping your cool. So if you think of like your white Eurocentric version of keeping your cool, what you're thinking, I like to imagine, I don't know if you guys watched Game of Thrones, but I like to imagine like the wildlings in the snow with like zombies attacking, and they're beating down the zombies, but all of them just have this really like stoic, unchanging face, like, this is what I do. I beat down the zombies. Zombies are, yes, no more undead. So that would be a white Eurocentric version of cool. And what is valued in white Eurocentric culture is clean, organized control. And that has to do with the aesthetic. So if we think about, for example, this is, I'm sorry for the ballerinas here in the room, but if we think about ballet as an example of an aesthetic that is highly revered in white Eurocentric culture, and you think about ballet blanc, you think about all of the women in the dance are shaped in the same shape, and they all have matching costumes, and we want them to have exactly the same positions and exactly the same movement, and to change formation and do their movements in perfect synchronicity. And that is, I'm not saying that that's not cool. I'm just saying that that is a very white Eurocentric idea of beauty. And in contrast, what this article is talking about in terms of African artistic beauty is that there's almost less of a fear of wildness being shut down. So you could have a cool face on top of a scary fight, just like you could in my zombie example. But you would also have a cool face on top of a very sexy dance move flirtation. You would also have a cool face amidst chaos, amidst improvisation, and that the idea in the African aesthetic of beauty is that you have both things happening at once all the time, this dichotomy. So in the white aesthetic of beauty, it's very controlled, very logical, very organized. But in the Black aesthetic of beauty, it's a acceptance that both things and many chaos can happen at once, and that the person who is most revered, be it the chief, be it the performer on the stage, they are being cool, but that doesn't mean that they can't handle or can't embrace sexuality, wildness, improvisation, and contrast. Does that kind of clarify this article? Please ask me questions. There's no, this is hardcore academic reading here that you're dipping your toes into. So it's totally okay for this to feel hard to wrap your brain around.
So just to kind of clarify, like as an analogy, maybe probably a weird one, like if like a teacher was like teaching like a seminar about like sexual education, like white cool would be like that kind of person that's like, no, let's not talk about it. It's like really, really awkward, and like they just want to completely avoid that like craziness. But like I guess like an African aesthetic of cool is like someone who embraces the awkwardness and is willing to like open up and talk about it. Kind
Yeah,
of.
I mean, I think that's an analogy that would relate in terms of educating with the white aesthetic of valued control versus educating with a value of transparency and acknowledging variety, which that's a good
Is that like in the general ballpark kind of, or am I like kind
no,
of off?
you're right. The next reading that we're going to do, and the next reading we're going to do is probably going to be the Brandon Dixon Gothschild. It's going to take this aesthetic of cool and break it into thinking about the aesthetic of cool in terms of dance movement and how you can see the Black aesthetic of cool has influenced. She's talking about concert dance, so she's talking about like 1950s on big stage performance, and how the element of coolness is apparent in movement. So just to give you a little hint about that coming up next, she's going to talk about this idea that you're mellow on top but crazy on the bottom. Like, hey girl, what's up? But you're freaking. Is also true in dance moves such as I'm trying to think of an example specific to our try it out from last week, and I think it's kind of consistently cool, like even or consistent that a lot of the time in those big dance moves that we did, there would still be this, the face is almost in a lot of those steps, the face is still calm and centered while the hips and the pelvis are moving big, right? But the face is still cool on top of the movement and fluidity of the body underneath. So that is one of the things that she'll talk about in terms of the elements of, anyway, we'll get to that next week. But does that make sense? Like this metaphor of riding suavely over the ocean of chaos being a valued aesthetic is going to be transformed in the next article to actual dance moves that we can see across many, many, many types of American dances that are absolutely in that way. You can link them back to Africa by examining these motifs, so to speak. Does that make sense-ish? Oh, this is a good thing to touch on. How are we doing? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I'm looking for my clock over here, not just showing you my armpit. Okay. I'm looking at this paragraph right here. Consider how we see this in breakdance ciphers, in stereotypical and more complex attitudes and body language. In minstrelsy, at world's fairs, and on circuits, white audiences from the 1700s and 1800s were fascinated and enthralled by the strength, agility, and sexuality of the Black and Indigenous performers. Yet, this fascination and admiration clashed with the inequity and abuse that was systematically being enforced upon their bodies by colonialist, racist, and classist social structures. One way in which society reinforced their denial of the inhumane standards was to exaggerate the other, or other subaltern is another word, performances and characters into stereotypes. For example, by combining the strength of an acrobatic dancer with a stereotype of ignorance or clumsiness, for example, the white audience could be impressed with his skill, which this dancer tumbles, but not feel as though they needed to treat him as an equal. And a Black woman's body and hip movements might inspire sexual desire in a white audience, but minstrel and variety show circuit would cover up this desire with ludicrous stereotypes as well, often casting men into female roles using exaggerated clown-like blackface makeup to flip that attraction into deniability. Black performers had to conform to these tropes in order to work in the entertainment field, and often use the aesthetic of coolness to add a layer of sarcasm and "can you believe these people are falling for this?" to their performances. It was the early 1900s when ragtime and then jazz music's popularity roared into the forefront of society that Black performers were seen on stage in tuxes and elegance without having to put a sarcastic wink and nod on. So that is that's how this article is going to transfer us into the next week's social dances. When jazz finally happened, it was the first moment. A lot of people see the jazz movement of the early 1900s as the beginning of the movement that brought us to the 1960s civil rights movement, because it was really up until then that Black people in America were absolutely still being cut out of being on stage with white people, or even in the same building and performing for white audiences, unless it was just one of them at a time. And that was still happening through up into the 1920s and beyond. And the way that these performers would be sharing their work, and the white culture, which was not okay with the quote unquote chaos of sexuality or the physical power that is athleticism and strength in breakdancing and tumbling. The white audiences, how could you, as a white reserved person who's obsessed with control, how could you watch the power of a performer who's flipping around and not feel scared or intimidated? And the answer is that they would, in their minds, make it a stereotype where this person is somehow less than in terms of intellect or whatever. And that worked to the Black performers' benefit, not benefit, this is really not the right word, but the aesthetic of coolness from Africa was able to take on that racism by sort of like laughing over the top of it back at the audiences. That's what this paragraph that I wrote here is. Do you guys have questions about that point right there? And I will lead us over here. So on our way out today, since we're close to the end of our hour, I wanted to bring us back up into not quite modern day, but close to modern day. So this is Quickstep. He's a founder of the Full Circle Productions. This is a lecture that was put on and toured by the Kennedy Center. It was given to high school students, so there's a little bit of a high school audience going on in here, but I think it's really great to see
hip-hop was about.
Especially
hip-hop started
this
in
section.
the community on the block. Someone brought some fried chicken. Someone brought a crate of records. Somebody brought their poetry. They said, yo, we broke, but we're going to celebrate right now. And the whole block came together, and they were like, yo, but there's no electricity. They're like, so, bing, put wires into the lamppost and had a party.
Yeah,
That vibe-
you laughing, but it really happened.
That vibe is what that vibe is what hip hop is made of. It's made of community. And before it's called hip hop, people just getting together to celebrate.
Definitely.
And they were celebrating each other's like uniqueness. So everyone in here is unique. You have something to bring to the table.
Definitely.
Okay?
And those 4 elements that we mentioned, well, 5, including beatbox, you can find that in any ancient tradition. You can go to China, you can go to Africa, you can go to Russia, and you will still find music, which today we have the DJ. You will still find the spoken word or the MC, who was probably someone who was in charge of recording the oral history. You will still find paint and painting on teepees or clothing, the way we have graph, and you always had dance. Dance was the way communities exchanged and celebrated the birth of a child, fertility, territorial conquest. We danced as humans. We have to dance. So these elements today may seem different, but it's what we've been doing for eons and eons.
And make sure there's they talk about the 4 elements, 5 elements of hip hop, but that's very basic. Hip hop has a lot of elements because humans are made up of many elements. So the 4 elements is just like the 4 basic wheels to a car. Yeah, it's cool, it's sitting there, but without knowledge of self and the person to drive it, it's not going nowhere. So understand where you're coming from so you can drive into the future. And with that said, now we're gonna get into this, the different elements of the hip hop dance. And one of the first ones that really broke open the scene was b-boying. Also,
Okay, I'm gonna pause here, even though I know that's really good stuff. I'll let that roll after this, but I want to take this contrasting comment from the same performer, the same director, choreographer, artist.
when I got into breaking, being that what I saw with tap, Lindy hop, swing, jazz, I was like, that's not happening with breaking. This has got to remain raw. It's got to remain ours. Because you know, we were learning lessons in Zulu Nation about how we function as a people, and what is ours, and how things fell out of our hands and became commercial, became codified. Now, let's fast forward to the present. 40 years later, what's happening with breaking, like America's Best Dance Crew? In that small window, the first 3 or 4 breakers were winning. And after that, they were like, okay, no, we're gonna do this other versions of like hip hop studio dance, and they're gonna be winning. And then it became kind of a little bit quirky, commercial. And then the audience that was raw, that was watching it, then turned away. There's a parallel that's happening now. We're still very young in the game when it comes to culture, only 40 years young. Super young compared to anything else that's been around for 500 years, 600 years. So I can imagine what was happening in ballet in the beginning and the struggles it was going through. Who made up what, you know, where was it made up, what town? We're going through that. We're still defining it ourselves.
And that's kind of the thing I want to leave you with, this question of how does making it big, how do you take dance, make it big, and not have it sell out? How do you remain cool under the pressure of oppression, really? And we had in our reading this last week, it's gonna scan back, we had a lot of short videos that I want you to just peek at, about appropriation, naming moves, and the way that, you notice he said that dances that were winning in America's Best Dance Crew started out with original breaking styles, but then became codified studio dances that were winning. And those codified studio dances are basically taking the original moves and making them all perfectly in sync with unified outfits. And just like we were talking about the difference between ballet and how that represents a Western Eurocentric idea of beauty versus the wildness and the control, having control over wildness without erasing that wildness that is considered beautiful and powerful in African culture. And there's some videos in here that I didn't go over. There's this magical thing. Please take a moment to pop into here. This is the Prezi diagram that I made. So it's sort of a review of where dances and steps are from. Nice little visual aid that I made, blah, blah, blah. So I'm gonna skip over that because 2 lectures at once. And just to sort of start to get used to asking questions about where things come from, what elements are from the culture that's in power versus what elements are from the originating culture. And then we had these are all like 2-minute videos. And I don't spend, this works so once you click on it, I don't spend too much time with these videos because we're gonna dip back into a lot of these things. So take a look at them now because they'll keep referring. But this is actually from the Chicago's World's Fair, and it talks about how things such as belly dance end up, and we're gonna get back to that in like, I think it's a D or E section when we talk about eroticization of the female body, but knowing how supposedly Greek or supposedly Arabic belly dances got morphed by becoming commercial, starting from the circus era. And then some totally awesome acrobatics. Here's KURIOS, which we watched today. This is another one that we didn't watch. And then I will, I'll post all of these other links that we looked at in our stuff we talked at summary that I post after the discussion. But in particular, I'm gonna add in this section because
Breaking, the media term is
I'm
called
gonna turn
breaking.
this off for the moment since we're just scanning through it. So he's gonna show with his dancers demonstrating in this next section, breakdancing, footwork. Can I fast forward well to it? Top rocking, What else is in here? It's about 15 minutes worth of this video. The whole thing is great to watch too, but I am going to leave this section for you. This is a professional pop locker who talks about the West Coast influences. So they're going to break down and demonstrate the different elements of hip hop dance as it developed in America, and especially in this section here. Feel free to watch the whole thing because it's performance in the beginning, it's performance at the end, but the little instructional part is this segment in here. So I will leave you that resource. And that, my friends, is a lot. Anything else that you guys need before I head out and wrap this puppy up for you? Are we good? Are we good? All right. With that huge information dump, please feel free to ask me questions. If anything is just seeming really confusing or heavy in the reading and you want me to dive deep on it next week, please feel free to email me and make some requests about what I focus on. And I am happy to oblige and clarify anything that I can. All right, guys, I'm gonna head on out.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, we got some questions. I can stay for questions.
Sorry, I
No.
just really want to have my head wrapped around this whole aesthetic cool thing. So like, just to kind of clarify with the whole ballet example you had. So that would be like an example of like white European like aesthetic of cool, and then like
I
with
wouldn't say like
or
cool, but of beauty might be an easier way to describe it.
oh, and then like black African American like cool would be like someone like doing like hip pulses, which is typically seen as sexual, but like still like not really seeing it as sexual, but embracing it and still having like this kind of calm, cool face while doing it kind of thing.
Absolutely still seeing it as sexual.
Oh,
So the white Eurocentric idea of beauty and accomplishment and what we value culturally shuts down those strong emotions of sexuality. It separates. I mean, if you think about, I'm thinking about militaristic moves, thinking about some of the Indlamu dances that we saw from Africa, like how crazy powerful and just flailing those Zulu dancers were. Do you remember that? And then compare that to what the colonialist military people were doing, right? They had followed from the Roman tradition of forming phalanxes in armies, right? So it's formations, it's lockstep marching. That is still like a very physical part of your training. They would do, if you think about, have you ever seen maybe a marching dance or a marching band or a changing of the guard in England where they have like a
baton?
Yeah, batons or rifles that they're flipping, but like all of those people are perfectly straight.
Mm-hmm.
There's never a moment where you let one of the warriors break out into their own demonstration in the changing of the guard, right? Everybody's controlled, everybody is assimilated, everybody looks the same.
Feel like white European cool, like very, very strict control, organized. Oh, so that's why you made the connection to the ballet, because like it has a lot of those same elements where it's very precise and very organized. Oh, but with like black, like it's like would like loose be a good word to kind of, or not like loose, but like less constricting?
Yeah. Hold on a second. Let me pull up that article because then I can sort of point to what pages I'm talking about in it. Let's open this up. So the thing that I think is cool about having this, like I can give examples of white marching bands, military demonstrations. This Thompson article is written about Black art. Black art. And I love that this article lets you see, like, this is a statue of a leader and how their eyes are very open, their mouth is very calm, right? And that their hair is done beautifully. They have like a specific hat on. They're in control. And all of those are beautiful aspects in this statue. And yet that doesn't mean that there's not craziness. Whereas if it were like a white bust, we would see
Defined cheekbones maybe, or like,
well, we would still see like a very calm, if you think of like a military statue, Emperor Norton or whatever, he's gonna have that same stern, suave look on his face, but he's not supposed to be wearing jewelry aside from like a medal, right? He's wearing a military statue in white Eurocentric culture is going to be conformative, and the celebration of leaders in Black artistic culture, those leaders are extravagantly dressed. They're wearing jewelry at the same time. They're able to be expressive in fashion, because this is not talking specifically about dance, and in movement, and still have their suaveness. And the way, like the quote that I have on the page that describes this article is the way that you identify the difference between like icy cold coolness in white Eurocentric culture versus the aesthetic of cool in African culture is that when white people are enjoying themselves, then it's okay to smile and laugh. And in this article, it explains how a chief or a person in power might have a totally extravagant, super colorful outfit on. They might be dancing in a really sexual manner with a person that they're interested in having a liaison with, but they're still going to be cool on top. Like their facial expression and demeanor is cool in times of pleasure as well as in times of stress.
oh, and that would be like the Black like aesthetic of cool.
Yeah, so this article it takes the time to sort of explain how that shows up in art. It takes the time to explain it. Let me see if I can find that spot. How the definition of the world, like in English, cool, composed, collected, unruffled, nonchalant, imperturbed, and in West African, nonchalant at the right moment, to reveal excitement and sentimentality, to reveal no emotion in situations where excitement and sentimentality are acceptable. In other words, to act as though one's mind is in another world. So women are admired for a surly, detached expression and somnambulistic movement and attitude during the dance or other performance is considered attractive. So like, if you can imagine what that sentence means is like a woman who could be totally doing a really intense twerk, but her facial expression is like, what? And that act of those contrasts, that contrast is what's admired in this aesthetic that they're talking about. So they talk about that here in terms of definitions of the word on this first page. Figural sculptures, and where's the part? The blending of muscular force and respectability. This here we are on page 42 or 4, depending on how you're looking at it. This segment about leaders, I think that was the part that really connected the dots for me.
Oh, I see. Here on that right there. But just to kind of cap things off, so like white cool is like actual control, like actual like, oh, you need to move in this precise way, but like Black cool, like aesthetic of cool is like doing things that are perceived as crazy. Like I think you brought up like Game of Thrones or like just like hip pulses and stuff like that, but still like embracing all of that and still putting up like a cool mannered, like straight face.
It's having the power to put up the straight face despite doing things that are considered crazy to white culture. I mean, and it wasn't in comparison to white culture because it came from Africa, but now we can compare the two things. So like white culture wants women to be modest and not sexual because it is threatening. So we just shut that right down and we make them, you know, stand up straight, close your legs together, and like look sweet and innocent and wear pink ruffles because it's too threatening that a woman could be empowered to take charge of her own sexuality, and therefore the patriarchy wouldn't know where its children are going for. And that isn't true in the Black aesthetic of cool, because in the Black aesthetic of cool, you're, instead of denying that sexuality that is inherent in every human being, instead of denying the physical power in, for example, if you were an old general and you had a young up and coming warrior underneath you, but you were speaking, you would want them to be, you know, if you're a professor and you're trying to make a point in white academic culture, stereotypically, the case has been that you guys are not supposed to interrupt me. But now that that isn't so valued, like I want you guys to ask me questions. I want you to jump in and ask me to dive deeper, and that we challenge these ideas together and get a broader perspective. And that is not a stereotypical white Eurocentric idea. Does that kind of make sense? It's like,
yeah, I think I think I'm starting to get it. Yeah, especially with the whole like with the sexuality stuff. It's like women like under like the white like cool, like it's just like you need to like dress up in a certain way, like buttoned up shirt and stuff like that. But with like the Black stuff, it's like not ignoring that sexuality and actually embracing it and like going and moving forward with it. So like, you know, you yeah, I think I'm starting to get it now. Okay, so
both value control, but
white cool is like a specific type of,
yeah, one controls or erases wildness in extreme physicality or extreme sexuality, and the other acknowledges it and says, I can still be cool on top. Like I can choose to go totally wild and be cool up here in my mind, even though we're having sensuous pleasure or ecstatic dance.
I see. Okay. I think so. I think in that case, I'll just write that down. I think other than that, yeah, sorry for all like the clarification.
No, you're asking really great questions. I love that we are getting them out there for people to see.
So I guess in that case, I'll make sure to maybe email you if I have any other questions. But other than that, have a great weekend, Professor.
Thank you, you too. And thank you for sharing your questions and insights with us.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Have a good weekend.